Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chimakonam. Dr. Chimakonam is a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and a research fellow at the Center for Interdisciplinary and Intercultural Philosophy at the University of Tübingen, Germany, and has held positions at the University of Calabar in Nigeria, and was a research associate at the University of Johannesburg. His teaching and research interests cover the areas of African philosophy, logic, environmental ethics, and postmodern, postcolonial, and decolonial thought. Dr. Chimakonam has edited a number of books, including African Philosophy and Environmental Conservation, Routledge 2017, African Philosophy and the Epistemic Marginalization of Women, Routledge 2018, co-edited with Louise Dutoit, has authored Ezumezu, A System of Logic for African Philosophy and Studies, Springer 2019, New Conversations on the Problems of Identity, Consciousness, and Mind, which was co-authored with Springer in 2019, and the forthcoming book, African Metaphysics, Epistemology, and a New Logic, A Decolonial Approach to Philosophy. This is coming out in 2021, Palgrave. Dr. Chimakonam has won the Jens Jacobsen Research Award for Outstanding Research in Philosophy by the International Society for Universal Dialogue, and recently was a recipient of University of Pretoria's Exceptional Young Researchers Award in 2021. Without further ado, please let us warmly welcome Dr. Chimakonam, who will be giving the talk titled The Logic of Decoloniality.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michael. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. And I also thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I understand that this is the last of the series. I also thank all those who gave this talk before me. I think I participated in almost all of them, and I learned a lot. I also want to thank those who have been able to spare their data to join us from different parts of the world. I hope it's worth it. Okay, so I'll be talking on the logic of decoloniality, the rider towards the bottom of things. Okay, and let me begin immediately. I hope I'm able to get this. Okay, yeah, that's right. Okay, let me begin with the conceptions of coloniality and decoloniality that I've been able to identify in the literature out there. Okay, so the first one is coloniality. I've read in the literature people who have conceived coloniality in a positive sense, all right? Positive as well as negative sense. Positive would include the imposition of meta-narrative, all right? In the sense that the European modernity is here construed as the only viable paradigm, and which, of course, is supposed to be extended to the rest of the world. So those who are thinking in this direction are thinking that perhaps it's a good thing that they are extending these marvelous, wonderful pertinences of Western modernity. And then the negative sense of it would be those who try to conceive coloniality as a repudiation of autoethnographies. And by autoethnographies, I mean the insider-driven discourse on the nature and perhaps various ramifications of a given cultural formation of knowledge. All right. So there are people who think that coloniality is also something very bad, morally bad speaking, and because it repudiates the cultural perspectives to knowledge, cultural wisdom, cultural formations, individual beings, and of course, lopsided power relations in different parts of the world. Okay, now come to decoloniality. I also have two conceptions, positive and negative. I begin with the negative. All right, some decolonial thinkers see decoloniality as a repudiation of meta-narrative. All right, that European modernity that has been imposed. Let's just dismantle it, because it shortchanges people from the other parts of the world. Okay, and a perhaps positive aspect of it would read the imposition of autoethnographies. Why is it an imposition? Those that I put under this label are likely going to reject it. But here is the point. The logic that undergirds coloniality is also the logic that undergirds that I've seen in the discussions of decoloniality by many people, all right? And that is the classical two-valued logic that really highlights one pair of the binary and residualizes the other. So if you deploy this logic in discussing decoloniality, and by chance you happen to succeed to accomplish that program, what are you going to have? You're going to establish a new coloniality, all right, in which the former norm will become normalized, and the formerly normalized will become the new norm. All right, so that is the lopsidedness that characterizes that logic, that two-value logic. So it's in this light that one can interpret that other conception of decoloniality from that angle. And you'd have to confirm this in the literature. A number of people have done that, but I have identified Walter Mignolo, 2007, page 485, where he talked about the two procedures of decoloniality. Okay, so besides all this, there are also some people who are questioning the wisdom and the clarity of decoloniality as a program. Okay, very recently, Raphael Winkler published an essay where he clearly questions that and said some stuff, okay, which I responded to as well and urged him to reconsider his position. I hope he's here today to be further persuaded to reconsider his position. I see people like Winkler are those who want to be convinced. They're classical philosophers. They want to be convinced. He's not convinced. And I hope he's here today so that perhaps he would eventually get convinced that those who've been discussing decoloniality all along have been able to create a mountain of literature that contain clear and precise explanations and ideas of what they mean by decoloniality. Okay, so moving from there, I also identified 3 strands of decoloniality out there, all right, 3 strands. And finding them inadequate, I am here going to propose a 4th strand, which will be my own contribution to the literature. Okay, so the first strand that I've identified in literature is what I call the insider decoloniality. All right, people who belong to this category tend to think, from within the border of Western modernity, border of European modernity, and they tend to repudiate the structure of that modernity. And some of the people and schools in this category would include postmodernists like Paul Fairbairn and Jean-Francois Lyotard, post-structuralists like Michel Foucault, deconstructionists like Jacques Derrida and the rest of them, and even world system theorists like Immanuel Wallenstein. Then come to the outsider decoloniality. Okay, those who belong to this category tend to think from the outside the border of European modernity, all right? And they tend to strive to repudiate subjectivity and structure as well. And some prominent theorists in this regard will include Frantz Fanon, post-colonialists like Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, Enrique Dussel, Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, world system theorists like Sama Amin, decolonial thinkers like Anibal Quintana, Walter Mignolo, Kwasi Wiredu, Gross Fogel, Nelson Maldonado Torres, and so on and so forth. And then come to the 3rd strand, and this is very interesting because I am beginning to notice the emergence of this category of people fairly recently. Okay, these are the category of scholars who neither things from within the border or from outside the border. They tend to think on the border. They think on the border. And and aspire to repudiate subjectivity and structures. Well, I will get down to explain some of these concepts in the course of the talk. And some scholars in that category would include Leonard Prague, as well as Bjorn Fretter. All right? Okay, so, but I found these strands really as rich as they are and as effectively that they have marshaled their thoughts in producing ideas in decoloniality studies, especially in terms of methodology and, of course, doctrine. There's a gap I see in literature. A gap I see in literature, and that gap is in terms of depth, it's in terms of foundation, it's in terms of logic. All right, coloniality has a logic. If you want to dismantle coloniality, if you want to shake up coloniality, you've got to get down to the bottom of things. You've got to get down to the foundation, and that is the gap I see in literature that I wish will make attempt to fill, or at least open up a new vista in that direction. Okay, so before we go down to the bottom of things, right? Let us refresh our minds about what really this decoloniality entails and why those who work on the area of decoloniality often have to confront the question about the unacceptability of coloniality itself. Okay, what makes it morally bad? What makes it evil? Why must we decolonize? Why must we decolonize? All right, and there have been several ideas in literature quite unconnected to the theorization about decoloniality, but which can effectively be brought into suit to justify, to highlight decades, if not centuries, of pain and experience orchestrated by European modernity that has made decoloniality imperative in this time. All right, and then we have Du Bois, who talked about double consciousness, all right? And Tempels, who talks about the creation of the evolus in the human beings that are outside the border, all right? Which Colin King describes as deraciness. And Fanon talks about that in terms of the colonized intellectual, and Antonio Gramsci talks about it with the concept of subaltern, which Spivak eventually borrowed much later in her post-colonial theorization. And Amos Wilson talks about the falsification of history, which in the first place establishes that line, that borderline, that frontier beyond which there is nothingness. And C.K. Raju prefers to talk about the distortion of intellectual history in different disciplines, beginning from mathematics, logic, and the rest of them. And what Jungo talks about, the cultural bomb that really destroys the cultural appurtenances and epistemic formation of a people, leading to linguicide. And Anibal Quintana talks about the lopsided relation of power that that such European modernity creates. Castro Gomez talks about the 0-point perspective, which Grossfogel has reformulated as the God's eye view perspective. And then he talks about colonialisis as a disease of the mind, that those who have been oppressed and who have felt the brunt of Western modernity, unbeknownst to them, suffer, which again affects what they do and whom they are, which is exactly the subject of coloniality of being that Maldonado Torres talks about. And the list goes on, which I cannot exhaust. I've made a thought to explain some of these ideas in a talk I delivered 3 days ago at the Satya Nilayam Institute of Philosophy, India. So I will not belabor this so much, but that gives us a perspective, that gives us grounding to understanding why coloniality as a program has to be dismantled, why people, decolonialists, are effectively and aggressively pursuing that cause. Okay, so but if we are to a kind of summarize the negative effects of coloniality in one word and one sentence to justify the campaign for decolonization, decoloniality, what would that be? I've surveyed literature, I've toyed with a lot of concepts, and I settled on difference. I settled on difference for a purpose. The reason I settled on difference is that it makes a lot of meaning to the supporters of coloniality, promoters of coloniality in Western modernity. It also makes is something that also makes a meaning to do in border thinking for those who are outside the border, all right? Those who are the fringes, the margins of this world, and what have you. And foundationally, it makes a whole lot of meaning because the source of the idea of difference is logic as well, okay? So, but the difference I talk about here is not the colonial difference, all right? It is the difference that is interpreted as inferior, but the difference that is interpreted or translated as variety, okay? Difference that is translated as variety, which is what Western modernity wants to stifle or strangle. Sarah Kwabehan talks about the universality, that the cloak of universality that Western modernity had adorned itself, all right? The ultimate veracious buttress, as he puts it, which Bruce Jans describes as a pretension of Western intellectual formation. And Innocent Asuzu cautions, using his principle of truth and authenticity criterion, that no word immanent missing link should ever elevate itself to an absolute instance, all right? But that, again, is what border thinking theorists are trying to highlight as part of what makes coloniality evil, diabolic, and the reason why it must be dismantled. So difference does not translate to inferiority, it translates to variety, and variety is the seat of identity, all right, both at individual and cultural levels. And so we should decolonize partly in defense of difference as variety, as Gramsci captures it in his present notes, especially the one on cultural hegemony that talks about those who've been excluded from the hegemonic cultures of the totalitarian regime in Italy from a Marxist perspective altogether, as a subject of another day. And M. Césaire, in his letter to Maurice Thorez, the then Secretary General of the French Communist Party, also in tendering his resignation, criticized the French communist ideology that is bent on elevating the Western idea to the universal and literally discounting the ideas of other people who are non-French, but who are also part of the same establishment of French Communist Party. All right, insisting that the universal should be constituted from diverse particularities, all right, which again is something that Enrique Dussel has been pursuing since 1977 when he published his book on philosophy of liberation, all right, talking about the understanding that reason is not is something that manifests in different cultures and should be liberated from the captivity of West European modernity, all right? And Walter Mignolo and Grossfogel also, again, talks about, in talking about colonial difference, attempts to contrast the ideology of the theopolitics of knowledge and ego politics of knowledge on the one hand, with the geopolitics of knowledge and the body politics of knowledge on another hand. Time permitting, we'll talk about some of these concepts. But that gives us grounding to understand how difference you can actually factor in different places, different sides of the border for those who want to approach some of these, the colonial ideas from the border thinking perspective. So like I said, difference is in the logic, all right? If you want to establish traces, you've got to trace it down to logic. And that is why I have put up this condensed idea before you, saying that in theorizing decoloniality, we can say a lot of interesting things about the subject, but if we haven't said anything about its logic, then we haven't said anything about its depth. Okay, so the potency of the poison of coloniality, ladies and gentlemen, is in its depth. It's in its depth. It's in its logic. Okay, because modernity is designed with a certain logical backbone and held their pertinences that have characterized modernity or that have grown forth from it are all grounded in that same logic and given force, okay, by that logic. So one of the ways that we can get to understand the place of foundation in decolonial thinking is to proceed from method, all right? When we ask the question, how should we decolonize, for example? And there are many opinions and proposals in the literature. Some have actually come from outside the decolonial studies itself, okay? But again, things that we can look at and say these ideas can fit in. All right. And I'm just going to point broadly different ideas that people have espoused. All right. Jean-Hens Jan and Bogumil Jusiski both of them talk about what they call the valuable integration of valuable past with relevant modernity. Okay. Integration of usable past with relevant modernity, respectively. And Amilcar Cabral, the Guinean nationalist, urged us to return to the source. Where did it all begin? Where is that source? That might be political, it can also be cultural. As the case may be, retrace our steps, see what we can do for ourselves with what we have, and how we can resolve our problems, even though in partnership with others, across the line. And Enrique Dussel talks about transmodernity, all right? In his work where he engaged the postmodernist Giovanni Vattimo, he tried to suggest that what the postmodernists are doing now is okay, they're okay, but not enough. Not enough because they are internal critics, and internal critics don't feel the pain as external critics would, all right? And additionally, that modernity had ceased being a European phenomenon alone. It now sucks every part of the world in. So it's also a global phenomenon, which means that those who are worst affected by modernity will definitely and should be a part of the critique or effort to dismantle modernity. So brought out the concept of transmodernity to characterize all of those things. And world system theories like Wallenstein and Amin also, join from that perspective, recommending their own ideas as well. Amin specifically gave us the idea of delinking, all right? In trying to tackle issues such as this, like attempting to decolonize, we've got to come from a global system, understand that the world works like a system now. And that system has sucked in those who were formerly colonized, all right, and subsumed and subjected to that paradigm, making it difficult for them to really grow economically, politically, and otherwise. And that there's a need for them to delink from that world system. They've got to delink, not in terms of establishing some form of cultural autarky, of course, but in terms of really finding their own solutions, solutions that respond to the questions that arise in their places, instead of being really controlled and spoon-fed from outside. All right, and this same concept of delinking is something that Anibal Quijano was also working on at the same time. It's really funny how language barrier could really affect research, even though Amin published his book in 1985 in French using the concept of la déconnexion, all right? It was upon translation in 1990 that the linking was used for that concept. But Aníbal Quijano was also working on the same thing, okay, in Spanish with the concept he calls desprendes and desprendimiento, all right? It's a kind of, again, disconnecting from that world system that really represses, suppresses, jinxes you, holds you firm, determines your movements, and ensures that you are not really growing as you should, okay? And ASOS, of course, recommends complementary reflection as an idea. Is when we decolonize and dismantle, let's just think about harvesting what is good and relevant from both sides and then complement it. Let's just be a complementary thing. And the Frenta talks about desuperiorizing on this other side of the border and de-inferiorizing on the other side of the border. These are all ideas can somehow be brought into the equation of decoloniality and a host of other ones. But as soon as we talk about decoloniality or how we should decolonize, we discover that we again led back to the question of the cause of coloniality. You've got to know what causes something you want to decolonize. You've got to know the source. If you don't know the source, you probably would have to be beaten about the bush. All right. So it's important we know the source. And some people, reading the literature out there, you get the impression that most people are thinking, okay, coloniality is caused by colonialism. Coloniality is a product of European modernity. Coloniality is it's virtually all the same, but that's not the view I hold. I look at the whole thing, the whole collection and cluster of concepts, and I think they are all hanging together, and they all have the same source. They all have the same cause. Yeah, colonialism may provide impetus for neocolonialism, but not in the sense of metaphysical notion of cause and effect. All right? So it can easily be deceptive when we think that colonialism causes coloniality, it causes neocolonialism, is a cause of imperialism, and so on and so forth. Or even taking a step back, that modernity causes all this. All right? I think these things are principal tropes hanging together with the same cause. And what is that cause? I believe it is the logic of difference. The logic of difference translated as inferior. That is the two-value logic, two classical value logic that Aristotle formulated in 300 years BC, some 300 years BC, in his prior analytics and posterior analytics, respectively. All right, and it's a logic that highlights a logic of binary opposition that highlights one pair of that opposition and residualizes the other. That is why the two opposed, two polar values in the two-value logic, are true and false. Truth and falsity, as the case may be. And you discover that when you begin to analyze propositions, evaluate them by these two polar values, you discover that there is something that is missing somewhere. For example, you can analyze a proposition in two-value logic as either true or false. All right, that's law of excluded middle. That's something that is excluded in that middle. It means there's no intermediate position. It is definitely this, either definitely this, or definitely that. All right, and that is too restrictive. Whereas that can engender a lot of precision, it also loses a lot by way of scope. Okay, which accounts for the limitation of that logic. And of course, it has very sad consequences when you begin to deploy that logic in human relations, in economic terms, and in education, most importantly. And that is part of why you discover that colonialists, when they arrived in different places to do their business and all that, they did not look at those people as fellow humans in the journey of life. No, okay, because it is them, and the rest. All right, and they are really the those that matter, those that count, and the rest must be discounted. So it is a logic that highlights the other pair of the binary and residualizes the other. Inevitably, that is how it is. And when you deploy this logic in a system of education, people are going to grow up, that way. Some people think of Western worldview as individualistic. It's also something they are trying to capture from their own perspective and understanding. So this logic underlies all of these things. Modernity was constructed and constructed to draw that sort of border that accommodates those who belong and those who do not belong out there. All right. Because of that logic, that is the mind view that logic gives you. And logic is something that grounds methods, and methods are the outline, the plan, the procedure that we tap into to do whatever we want to do. And so they shape our view of life. They shape our understanding of virtually everything. And that is the logic that grounds coloniality. You cannot be to dismantle coloniality, still using and thinking within the framework of that same logic. It's not really going to work successfully. If you, in practice, succeed in dismantling that coloniality, you're only going to establish a new coloniality. And that is what you see in international politics and diplomacy. It's always about a winner takes it all. But it doesn't mean that that's the only logic we have. There are other ways to reason and think. And that is what I am going to demonstrate in this work. So when you look at the demo you have there about these logics, to spare you the technicalities of that logic, when you, like I said, if you are evaluating a proposition in terms of true and false, and you say that that proposition is either true or false, law of excluded middle. If it is false, then it cannot be the case that it is true. That is law of contradiction. If it is true, then it is true, law of identity. Okay, so that's lopsidedness. It is strict. It guarantees precision, which is really its advantage. But then it has a lot of implications and terrible effects when deployed in human activities, education and human relationships, economy, and what have you. And look at the demo before you. Both of them are the same thing. The one on the left is vertical, the one on the right is horizontal. So let's think about, so that you would understand the unequal binary that this logic establishes. Okay, think of the values true and false. What variable do you have under true? Male. What variable do you have under false? Female. Okay, now think about the gender inequalities, the inequalities and marginalizations and subordinations we witness nowadays in terms of gender, in terms of, sorry, it appears my face is dark, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality and what have you. And you discover, Ray, this is coming from this logic. Think of European and African. All right, one is true, one is false. That's lopsidedness. Think of presence and absence. It is the same thing. All right. In fact, deconstructionists like Jacques Derrida have tried to demonstrate really how this binary, unequal binary opposition affects and determines and really causes some of the problems we have in the world. Okay. For example, they talk about presence. If they want to apply it to a concrete case like a human being, they said that a male is an individual in whom there is a presence of phallus. All right, there's a presence of penis in the male. What about the female? It's an individual in whom there is an absence of phallus. It's an absence of penis. So the vagina is residualized. It is not something important. It is just a sign for an absence. All right, and I did not really, I read it, I understood this some years ago, but I did not really have the impact of it until one day I was traveling as this ancient cathedral in Europe. It must be Austria or something. And it was a tourist zone. And I was there and I was looking at the church, the cathedral in front of it, outside. Okay, the pillars, two pillars by the two doors of the cathedral. On top of the one of the pillars, you see phallus there. Okay, you see the male organ molded there. And then on top of this other one, it's virtually like absence. All right, you see something there, but the image that strikes you immediately is that of absence. It's not that of a vagina, it's that of absence. All right, so that is how the power of binary opposition and unequal binary opposition, which the two-value logic really introduces. Okay, so it is important, therefore, for us to get down to the bottom of things when we are talking about decoloniality. And indeed, the other sundry fields, we've got to get down to the bottom of things, all right, where we ought to start. And that is logic, all right? It is true that some decolonial thinkers like Nolo and even war system theorists like Amin have in their various writings talked about logic of coloniality, logic of war, capitalist expansion. But in reading them, you do not really see them articulate that classical two-value logic as such. They are virtually talking about this logic as a mindset. Oh yes, it's all part of it. But it's important that we identify that system of logic as a foundational structure that grounds some of these principal tropes that really affect humanity and the world, you know, at large. And so But again, you have to say that some of these decolonial thinkers and philosophers are joining late in that debate anyways, have not been, they're not philosophers. Some of them are sociologists, anthropologists, area studies specialists, and what have you, all right? And of course, there's a very recent collection I will recommend to anyone, edited by my very good friend Veli Mitova, okay, last year, and which was approaching the discourse from the dimension of epistemology, epistemic decolonization, and was quite rich and contributes to the discourse, immensely. However, again, you notice the really almost near absence of, thinking in depth, going to the foundation, getting down to the bottom of things. All right. So you see, prevalent in literature on decolonization, ideas that are and proposals that are pursuing methodological and doctrinal approaches to decoloniality, and very little, if any, to the best of my knowledge, that are really getting down to the bottom of things, the logic of decoloniality. There are two logics that are involved here. When you talk about the logic of coloniality, that's something that you have to dismantle. You have to also think about the logic of decoloniality that will, again, effectively replace it and engender a system that will not, again, repeat the cycle of coloniality and the colonized, as the case may be. And that is what I bid to do here. So perhaps I should distract you a bit and tell you that even the famous Sarge in the popular movie series Star Trek also supports my proposal. Can you imagine that? Captain Spock says that logic is the beginning of wisdom. All right, and again, except that he says it's not the end of wisdom. All right, it's the beginning of wisdom, Valeris, not the end of it, which again is what I disagree with him. Captain Spock made his name by being logical and rose to the ranks. All right, a great man, a logician, had a lot of admirers, including Valeris, the young lieutenant. But at a point, at a crisis, a great crisis point in the affairs of the Federation, Captain Spock reached the limit of his logic, the two-value logic. All right, he could not find valid premises to deduce his conclusions anymore, and he declared that it is maybe the beginning, but not the end. But logic is both the beginning and the end. The problem is when you have a system, and that is what I try to condense here in talking about the expressive powers of different systems of logic. All right, if there is a structure which existing systems of logic cannot express, there is always another system that can. We just have to invent it. All right, we just have to invent it. And folks, logicians like Kanaf supports this agenda insofar as the semantic and the syntactic principles and rules of that such a system is properly formulated. And Riza, of course, contributes by saying that again would require tweaking the laws of thought. But it's perfectly in order. It's all up. It's perfectly in order. But we are, however, so used to the European modernity that structures everything, social life, science, economic, political, bases all of them on the foundation of two-value logic, making it look as if there cannot be any other logic. All right? And when we reach the zenith of this logic, we tend not to know what else to do. But Hilbert tells us that the power of human reason is immense. In a talk he delivered before the World Mathematical Congress in Paris in 1900, he talked about the axiom of solvability of every problem. He calls it an axiom. It demonstrates his conviction that any problem a human mind sets at can be, resolved, given sufficient resources and time. And I believe that, these were the motivations behind my formulation of Izume's logic. All right? Okay. Because of that, if in formulating a new knowledge, a new logic to replace the logic of coloniality would, of course, affect our conception of decoloniality, such that instead of a repudiation of ideologies, all right? Western modernity repudiating cultural formations, and other people trying to repudiate. It's a conflict, it's a clash, it's a tussle to know which one succeeds, winner takes it all. It doesn't have to be that way. So instead of that sort of conception, which I painted at the beginning of this talk, we can actually have a conception of decoloniality that sees it as an authentication of ethnographies towards the complementarity of opposites, where different autoethnographies, including the Western itself, is presented and captured as what it is. It's again another cultural formation, all right? And but the emphasis there is on the word authentication. By that, I do not mean endorsing, I do not mean validating. I mean a process that involves three dimensions of thought, okay? The architectural, the doctrinal, and the foundational. And that leads me to the fourth strand of decoloniality, because to assemble all of these new ideas requires another strand of decoloniality, which I call conversational decoloniality. Here's the first one, my proposal. Fourth one, my proposal. All right, and I contrast with the other three strands in that, unlike the other three strands, it's not a thinking within or outside the border, or even on the border. It's a non-border thinking, so to speak. All right, but there are nuances between this and the border thinking that some people who are extending critical theory into critical border thinking, have in mind. That's not what I have in mind here. All right, again, unlike the second and the third concept strands, it does not repudiate subjectivity. No, because humanity is the same everywhere. That's humanity in the person of A has done some terrible things to the humanity in the person of B. It does not mean destroying the humanity in the person of A. All right? Why don't we think of really getting down to the bottom of things where this whole mistake started from in the beginning? Okay, again, it authenticates autoethnographies, and it's characterized by architectural thinking, doctrinal thinking, and foundational thinking. And is based on three valued logic, okay, which has truth glut in the middle. What was excluded in the law of excluded middle has now been returned in the law of anonymity. That serves as a supplementary law to this new system of logic that I and some other people are promoting. Okay, so and can demonstrate, yes, that structure of Ezumezu logic, which is a three-value logic, and you can contrast this, what you have before you, with what I demonstrated earlier concerning two-value logic. All right, so you can see there's a middle position there, and that middle position, let's us even begin with the two polar values, truth and falsehood, Ezu and Izu. The understanding of Ezu and Izu is not precisely as the understanding of truth and falsehood in their strictness, in their strict terms. No, here they are independent values, but somewhat fractional, such that they are 10 whole in the middle, all right, in Ezumezu, where it is a truth glut, not a truth gap, and which means they complement instead of binary contradiction. Here we're talking about binary complementarity. All right, and it is this logic that, as I bid to conclude, it is this logic that we can deploy when we have dismantled the logic of coloniality, by demonstrating that there's something missing, there's something not right about the logic that undergirds modernity, that logic that grounds coloniality, that grounds colonialism, imperialism. It's always a divisive, polarizing, dichotomizing logic. All right, when we demonstrate that and displace it, we replace it, we bring in its place Ezumezu logic as a system that can do better, really. All right, and in deploying that, as we get to the bottom of things, in deploying that, we have a new strand of decoloniality we call conversational decoloniality, okay, with three dimensions of decolonial thinking. The architectural, that refers to method We've got to decolonize. We have to decolonize method. You can use the method that enthroned coloniality and hope to have something new. Method shapes ideas. Methods shape doctrine. It's important that it is decolonized. And people are doing that already. There are different ways. All right. So the architectural represents method, and the doctrinal represents the ideas and theories that people weave here and there. And you can see how it departs from the vertical double-headed arrow that I used to represent the architectural dimension, showing that method is what shapes doctrine, but beneath is foundation. That's logic, because method rests on a logic. All right, that is why if you come to a system, you can only have one logic undergirding a given system, but you can have many methods, which represents different ways of articulating or expressing the laws of that very logic. And then you have doctrine that can be shaped by these other different methods. All right, those who have interest in understanding these three dimensions of decolonial thinking, I invite you to join the talk I will give tomorrow at the University of Tübingen in Germany. It's one of the ideas that I will explore in that talk. But permit me to tell you by way of summary that to decolonize effectively, we have to get down to the bottom of things, and that is logic. Thank you very much. I'll pause here, take your questions, criticisms, and contributions, as the case may be. I thank you all. I appreciate you all for coming out, sparing your data to listen to me, and of course, the organizers for inviting me for this talk. Thank you very much. Thank you.